Today's daf is daf Lamed Aleph, and we'll start on the last line on Lamed Amid Beis, and we're talking about a statement of Rabbi Chanina that we paskin like Rab Shimon Shazuri. On the one hand, it was not clear what ruling of Rab Shimon Shazuri Rabbi Chanina was accepting. But one thing is clear, that it was his own opinion that we rule like Rab Shimon Shazuri, and it was not a ruling that was accepted by earlier Amoraim, because had it been accepted by early Amoraim, then Rabbi Chanina would have simply quoted those Amoraim. He wouldn't have said it as if it was his own. So the Gemara has been searching for a Mishnah or a Brisa of Rab Shimon Shazuri where there were no Amoraim who committed themselves in an earlier historical period to paskin and rule like Rab Shimon Shazuri, and it was only Rabbi Chanina. So, for example, the Gemara has a Mishnah regarding Zroim and regarding Hafrashas Masros. There's another Mishnah regarding Tum and Tara, regarding a Shida, a carriage. And in all these Gemaras, we really haven't come up with a definite answer. But Ella Omer Rav Papa Ashida and Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak Omer Yayin. So Rav Papa finds a Mishnah about a Shida, which, as we said before, is a carriage made out of wood. And in that issue, Rabbi Chanina paskins like Rav Shimon Shazuri, whereas according to Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, there was an issue about Yayin, and in that context, Rabbi Chanina paskin like Rav Shimon Shazuri. So now we start on Daf Lamed Aleph, Ashida. So we're learning now a Mishnah in Maseches Kelim that deals with Tuma V'Tara, and the background to this Mishnah is that we derive the susceptibility to tumah, to contamination, from the pasuk that mentions a sak, which is a sin kuf. A sak is a receptacle, which means that it has a kli kibul, and it's movable. It can be moved from place to place. But other kelim, if, for example, they reach a certain weight and it makes it difficult, if not impossible, to move it from place to place, that it's not dumya de sak, it's not similar to this sackcloth that's the paradigmic case of Kabbalah's Tumah, and therefore it's Eino Makabel Tumah. And now the Mishnah is going to record in Masechta Kelim Machlokes exactly what is the great size of this Shida such that it's not Makabel Tumah. And Hashida Beit Shammai Omrim Nimdedes Mi Bifnim. In order to measure how large of a utensil it is, and does it have more than Arboim Sa'ah, which is the shear, that's the amount of volume beyond which it becomes such a large kli that it's not Makabel Tumah. You measure it from the inside, the airspace inside the carriage. And you do not measure the walls and the thickness of the walls that surround the carriage. But Beis Hill Omer Mibachutz, Beis Hill say we're going to measure to arrive at 40 saw from the outside. You put your meter on the outside, and you're basically calculating not only the airspace inside, but also the thickness of the walls on the outside. So Beis Hill being makil, and in a kli like the shida, which Beit Shammai would determine as being tameh, meaning if a sheretz came in contact with that shida, Beit Shammai would say it's tameh because it only has, let's say, 38 saw, and Beit Shammai not willing to add the extra 2 saw by measuring it from the outside. But Beis Hillel are mekil, and therefore it's not makabel tum according to Beis Hillel. Umodim elu vi elu, which seems to mean at the face of it that Beis Hillel are admit and accept Beit Shammai she'ein ovi raglayim vi ovi haliv levizvizin nimdad. So let's go slowly here. We have ovi haraglayim. What it means is the carriage stands on legs, small legs, low, but there is airspace below the wall, below the floor of the carriage, between the floor of the carriage and the ground, because there are legs that hold it up. And Beis Hillel is going to agree and concede this point that when you're calculating the volume of the carriage, you don't calculate the airspace below the carriage, between the carriage and the floor, the ground floor, the ground, which is called the Ovi Araglayim. And then there are all sorts of straps and so forth that surround the carriage, to help schlep it or whatever it is. And those straps also take up a certain volume. And Beis Hillel Moda, they concede to Beit Shammai that those straps are not integrated into the calculation of the volume. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Modim sha'ovi raglayim v'ovi ha'levizvizin nimdad. Now, this is a very strange statement here of Rabbi Yossi. Tosfos has a major problem here because what do you mean modim? We just finished saying that even Beis Hillel will not calculate, the airspace at the legs or, different kinds of straps and lips and so forth that are attached. Now you're telling me modim, nimdad, that they are calculated. Who's modim that they're calculated? Ubeineim ein nimdad. But as far as the distances here, that's not calculated. Rabbi Shimon Shizuri Omer, this is the punchline of this whole story from the Mishnah in Kalim. It all depends how tall are the legs, meaning how much airspace there is. If the legs are more than a tefach, right, a tefach is about 6 inches high off the ground, then the airspace is not calculated and added to the volume of the carriage of the shida. But if the airspace dips below 1 tefach, then we calculate it. In any event, Rav Papa, as we saw on the bottom of Amud Beis of Daf Lamed, claims that this last psak of Rabbi Shimon Shizuri was what Rabbi Chanina had in mind when he said that we paskin like Rabbi Shimon Shizuri. And the reason why Rabbi Chanina did not quote any early Amoraim is because there were no earlier Amoraim. He was the first to paskin like Rabbi Shimon Shizuri, and the calculation of the carriage of the shida will depend upon whether or not the raglaim are 1 tefach plus high or less than 1 tefach. However, Rab Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar Ayayin, that the psak of Rab Chanina in favor of Rab Shimon Shizuri was regarding yayin. And now we're getting into the sugya of what's called liquids, nozlim. And in the Gemara's language, in modern Hebrew, we call it nozlim, but in the Gemara's language, it's called mashkin. Now, what's unique about mashkim is that if the mashkim come in contact with the dover hametame, they always remain a rishon l'tumah. So it matters not what came in contact with these mashkim, because we always have an avatuma, and then we have a rishon l'tumah, and a sheni l'tumah, and a shlishi l'tumah. With regard to liquids, it's always standard. It doesn't change. It's always going to be a rishon l'tumah. And that's what the Mishnah is going to tell us in Masechta Taros. Rabbi Meir Omer, Shemen Tchila, the word Tchila means Rishon L'Tuma, Li'olam. In other words, no matter who came in contact with the oil, it always remains a Rishon because it has the status of a Mashke. Chachamim Omrim, on the other hand, Af Hadvash. Why leave out honey? Because even Dvash has the status of a Mashke. And as such, it always remains a Rishon L'Tuma. Reb Shimon Shazuri Omer Af HaYayin. Why, says Reb Shimon Shazuri, do you limit it to Shemen and to Dvash? Expand it to include Yayin as well. Yayin is a Mashke, and therefore Yayin will always remain a Rishon L'Tuma. Now, the Gemara goes on a little digression here before we get into the final psak of Reb Chanina, like Reb Shimon Shazuri, according to Reb Nachman Bar Yitzchak, in the case of Yayin. And the Gemara says, Mechlal de Tanakama Sover Yayin Lo. The language of Af in Reb Shimon Shazuri, Af Yayin, implies that I want to add something, says Reb Shimon. Meaning the original Tanoim that came before him did not accept Yayin as a mashke. So the Gemara says that's impossible. Yayin is no less than a mashke than Shemen or Dvash. Aim of it, therefore, we have to change the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon Shazuri Omer Yayin. Leave out the word Af. Now, once again, just to make a reference to the Tosfos here, the Tosfos doesn't have too much luck over here with this sugya. He doesn't understand. He's totally baffled because we know that there are 7 mashkim, and amongst them are Yayin, Shemen, and Dvash. So how could it be that the Tanoim that came earlier, for example, Rabbi Meir only had Shemen, but he didn't have Dvash, or right? Right, and the Chachamim had Dvash, but they didn't have Yayin until Reb Shimon Shazuri added Yayin. It just simply doesn't make any sense because we know that there's 7 mashkim, and amongst them are Yayin, Shemen, and Dvash. Ema Rabbi Shimon Shazuri Omer Yayin, so we took out the word Af, and now we have Reb Nachman Bar Yitzchak who's saying that we paskin like Reb Shimon Shazuri in this Mishnah of Yayin, and there were no earlier Amoraim who were committed to that ruling, and therefore it's the original ruling of Rabbi Chanina. Now, we said that Rabbi Chanina accepts Reb Shimon Shazuri, and it sounds like Reb Chanina would apply this straight across the board. In other words, whenever we have Reb Shimon Shazuri quoted in any context throughout Shas, according to Reb Chanina, we're going to always accept and paskin like Reb Shimon Shazuri. And therefore, the Gemara wants to ask whether or not we should include in this list of rulings where we accept Reb Shimon Shazuri the following Brisa, Tanya. Now, please note that this is a Brisa. Until now, we've been dealing with Mishnayos. That's important. It sounds technical, but Amar Reb Shimon Shazuri. Pam achas nisarev li tevel b'chulin. Now, here's the problem. When you have tevel, which means there was no afrosha, trumas, and maestros, and it's also with the chiv misa b'dei shamayim, you need to be mafresh. You have to take off truma, you have to take off maser, but you can't take off trumas and masers from something that already had a hafrosha, which is called chulin. So the problem that Reb Shimon Shazuri addresses is that he now has a mixture of both tevel, which requires hafrasha, and chulin, so that he can't be mafresh mineu bei. Mineu bei means from the mixture itself. Because if he takes off something for the Kohen or for the Levi from the mixture, then it might possibly be that he'll pick up the chulin. And if he picks up the chulin, which has already been subject to tithing, then it cannot function to tithe that which is tevel. Ubasi v'shalti is Rabbi Tarfon. I asked Rabbi Tarfon for an aid, so what should I do? The Omer Li and he told me, Lech kach lecha min hashuk va'aser alav. Go out to the shuk and purchase tvua, peros, and then take that which you buy in the shuk and be mafresh it in order to remove the tevel that's in your mixture from its status as tevel. Meaning that when you buy something in the shuk, you go out to the marketplace and you buy, grains or whatever it might be, then you have to be mafresh from them. So it's a chiyuva al chiyuva. It's not min aptur because you have to be mafresh. Now, why do you have to be mafresh when you go out to the shuk? Why don't you rely on the mocher, on the one who's selling you? He's maybe he's wearing a yarmulke and maybe he's not, I don't know, whatever he is, that he himself was mafresh maser. But the answer is there's something called tmai, and tmai means that when you buy tvua min hashuk, then you cannot rely on the fact that most amaratzim, even ignorant people, will be mafresh. So you have to assume that there was no afrosh, and the Rabbanan required you to make afrosh. So now we have to understand, if tevel in this mixture is doraisa and it requires hafrasha midin Torah, how can you be mafresh from tmai, which is only drabanan? A drabanan vis-a-vis a doraisa is called min aptur al achiv, and that won't work. So the Gemara answers, kasava doraisa beruba batel, that he holds against the principle called Dover Sheish L'Matirin. Dover Sheish L'Matirin, again, that's an hour's discussion, but basically it means something that can become permissible. Right now it's prohibited. Then if it gets mixed up in a mixture, it's never batel. But even though tevel is a Dover Sheish L'Matirin, because all you have to do to remove these tevels be mafresh, but nevertheless, according to the Shita of Shimon Zuri, there still is bittul, even in the davar sheyesh lo matirin. So Reb Shimon Zuri never accepted the principle called davar sheyesh lo matirin afilu be'elef lo batel, but rather it's batel b'rov. And the reason it's batel b'rov is because of another principle in Tarov is called yavish b'yavish, but that's not for us now. Anyway, rov ami haaretz masrinhem. When you go to the market, you should assume that in most cases the seller was mafresh maser. Now I don't know if that's still the case today. If you go to Shuk Machne Yehuda and you buy yourself fruits, vegetables, grains, whatever it might be, I'm not sure if you have a right to assume that in all likelihood the mocher was mafresh. I don't know. They usually have a tudah, on top that says, a rabbinic body that says that we testify that they removed trumas of masos. But in any event, the Rabbanan said we are not going to rely on rov. We're going to require a hafrasha. And therefore, havile kitorim and aptur al aptur. What does that mean? The tevel got mixed up in rov chulin, and therefore on a doraisal level, according to Rabbi Tarfon, it was batel barov. The Rabbanan said, well, you know what? We're not going to rely on rov because of davar sheyesh matirin, and therefore we're going to require that you do a matir to be mafresh on. So that's called min aptur. What does that mean, min aptur? It means it's only chayav midrabbanan, not midorais. There's no biblical obligation. It's only rabbinic. So too in Tamai, we're going to say that rov ha'me'aretz ma'asrin heim. Most amoritz will take off the maser, and therefore it's only the rabbanan who required hafrasha. So therefore, it's min aptur al aptur. Everything is equal. They're both derabanan. Frekta Gemara, when Rabbi Tarfon gave this advice to Rav Shimon Zuri, why didn't he give him a different advice? Lemale, why couldn't he say to him, Lech kach min ovi kol chavin? Why don't you just simply buy tvua from a non-Jew? And if that be the case, on a doraisal level, because the karka, the ground, is owned by a non-Jew, therefore, on a doraisal level, there's no chiyuv trumas u'maasros, there's no tevel. The Rabbanan required that you be mafresh even when it's kinyan akum, even when it was owned by a god. And that would be a perfect solution to the dilemma that Reb Shimon Shazuri presented to Rabbi Tarfon. Namely, the solution would be go to the shuk and buy tfuah from the guy. And if you buy tfuah from the guy, kasavar ein kinyan leovik chavim bertzol afkim yad maser, the Gemara says the following: you want to assume that since the ground was owned by a non-Jew, therefore on a deraisa level, according to Torah law, there's no requirement of Trumas and Maisus because yesh kinyan. No. Rabbi Tarfon holds ein kinyan lo v'kombet saf kimi de Maisa, meaning that even if it was owned by a guy, nevertheless the Torah still requires hafrashas Trumas and Maisus. That's a biblical requirement, and therefore Rabbi Tarfon could not give this advice to Reb Shimon Shazuri to tell him to be mafresh from that which he bought from a guy, because that which he bought from a guy is chayiv in Trumas and Maisus midaraisa, and therefore havilei menachiv al aptur. Meaning, if you buy fruits, vegetables, etc., from a guy, then on a deraisa level, it's tevel. You have to be mafresh Trumas and Maisus, because we're holding now ein kinyan liakum lafkir midei maseh. So this eitzah, this suggestion would not have worked. Ika diamri. Now we have a different transmission of the entire brisa from the get-go. Amalei. This is what Rabbi Shimon Shazuri said to Rabbi Tarfon. I'm sorry. This is what Rabbi Tarfon responded to Rabbi Shimon Shazuri. Lech kach min ovid kol. Go buy tfuah from the guy. And kasavar yesh kinyan liovd kohav bertzolaf gividei ma'aser. So on a deraisa level, it's not tevel, and there's no chiv maser. The Rabbanan required it. Okay, so if it's a Rabbanan, then you could be mafresh min aptur al aptur, and the hafrasha would be valid. Mavilei min aptur al aptur. Frek Gemara, according to the second version, the Lishon of Asol lemo lei. Why couldn't Rabbi Tarfon give him a different eitzah? Kach me'ashuk, go buy minashuk, which means rov ha'me'oretz ma'asenem. So the whole issue of buying minashuk is tevel derabanan, which is called d'mai. And the answer is kasaver ein rov ha'aretz ma'asenem. He never bought into the fact that most of the ignoramuses in the community would go ahead and be mafresh mas. Is memela. If he doesn't rely on that, then when you buy something from the shuk, it is chayav in masus doraisa, according to the shita. And therefore, since on a doraisa level in the tarovis, the mixture of tevel and chulin, the Torah would say it's batul barov, and therefore the tevel is no longer in existence, so to speak. And therefore, it's only D'Rabbanan that D'Rabbanan said, oh, it's a Dover Sheish Matirin, we're not going to rely on Bittul, Afilu Belaflo Batel, and now you're going to be Mafresh Menachiv Al Ptur. Sholach le Rav Yemar Bar Shelmia le Rav Papa. Omar Ula Omar Rab Chanina. Halacha Rab Shim ben Shazuri. V'lo od el kol makom sheshana Rabbi Shimon Shazuri halacha kamosa. So now we have a statement that's attributed to Rabbi Chanina. Right, we've been talking a lot about Rabbi Chanina, who paskins like Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, and he makes a statement that, you know what? Wherever we find a machlokas, and one of the disputants is Reb Shimon Shazuri, we're going to pass like Reb Shimon Shazuri. So on that, they asked him, Af bin is ariv le tevel b'chulin. This statement that we pass like Reb Shimon, does that include even the brisa that we just learned about the mixture in which Reb Shimon Shazuri requested an answer from from Rabbi Tarfon, or lay in? I don't get it. Says Rav Ashi, I don't get the whole story over here. You need to tell me that we paskin like Rav Shimshon Missouri, even in this brisa regarding the tarovis between Tevel and Chulin. Why do I need that for? Omar Le Marzutra, Koshi Be Rav Chanina Bisur Pshita. Rav Chanina asked the question Pshita. I mean, why do you have to go out of your way to include this case of a tarovis of Tevel and Chulin? We know that we always paskin like Rav Shimon Shizuri. Why would I think otherwise?